The millionaire's mother terrified everyone, but the maid changed the rules. Public humiliation. Get out of my house, you starving Indian woman. You don't even deserve to breathe the same air as my family. The words fell like stones onto the marble of the ballroom, and for an eternal second no one in the world seemed to breathe. The Villanueva mansion was the closest thing to paradise that money could buy that night. 3 stories of contemporary colonial architecture rose from the hills of Mexico City, illuminated from outside by spotlights that tinted the white walls gold. Inside, 400 candles arranged in crystal chandeliers made the air almost sacred. The main hall measured almost 800 square meters and had been decorated by a French designer specially brought from Paris for the occasion. The 50th anniversary of the Villanueva Corporativo Company, one of the most powerful industrial conglomerates in Mexico. The guests were exactly the kind of people who never raised their voices in public because they didn't need to. Senators, businessmen, judges, ambassadors, women wrapped in Chanel and Valentino, men with watches that cost more than a house in Coyoacán. They had all arrived that night to celebrate. No one had witnessed what was about to happen. Valentina Cruz had been working in that mansion for 3 months. She was 26 years old, with black hair tied back in a neat bun, and she wore the blue and white uniform that Doña Carmen Villanueva demanded with military precision. Knee-length skirt, pressed apron, closed-toe shoes with low soles. That night she had been assigned the appetizer area, circulating among the groups of guests with a silver tray, offering smoked canapés and glasses of Don Perignon, which cost what she earned in a week. She had learned to become invisible. It was a skill she had cultivated carefully, just as she had learned to walk quietly on marble, to anticipate when someone needed a napkin, to look down exactly when it was necessary. 3 months in that house had taught her that invisibility was the best armor. But that night, something went wrong. It had been an accident, or at least that's how any reasonable person would see it. Valentina was spinning among a group of guests when a senator's husband stepped back without looking, and the collision was inevitable. The tray tipped, a single glass of champagne slid, and the cold liquid fell in a perfect parabola onto the ivory silk dress of Doña Carmen Eugenia Villanueva de Villanueva. The silence that followed was instantaneous and total. Doña Carmen was 61 years old, and she was one of those women who seemed to have been born with an awareness of her own importance. Thin with the silent violence of someone who had spent decades denying herself bread, that night she wore a red dress embroidered with gold thread diamond earrings that had cost her dollars, and her platinum blonde hair pulled back with a perfection that seemed to defy gravity. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, with a coldness that intimidated before one understood why. She turned very slowly. Her eyes found Valentina. "You," he said, and that single syllable contained an entire universe of contempt. Valentina opened her mouth. "Mom, it was an accident." "Me? Shut up." The word was so sharp it cut through the air. Several guests took a small, involuntary step backward. A woman near the window brought her hand to her mouth. Doña Carmen approached Valentina with slow, controlled steps, as if she had all the time in the world, as if the 400 people watching them were simply part of the set. She stopped less than half a meter from her, and Valentina had to resist the physical urge to back away. "This dress," Doña Carmen said quietly, but perfectly audible in the absolute silence of the room, "it cost 42,000 pesos. It was designed for tonight." "Tonight specifically, ma'am. I'm so sorry it was. I told you to be quiet." "Don't." Valentina closed her mouth. Doña Carmen looked her up and down with calculated slowness, with that gaze that strips people not of their clothes but of their dignity. "Look at what you are," she finally said. "A small-town Indian who doesn't even know how to carry a tray, who... Where did they get you from? From the Tepito market or some garbage dump in Oaxaca?" Someone in the crowd let out a sound. It wasn't exactly laughter. It was something worse. The cowardly discomfort of someone who enjoys the spectacle but doesn't want it to be noticed. "Get out of my house," Doña Carmen continued, raising her voice barely so that it would carry to every corner of the room. "Living Indian woman, you don't even deserve to breathe the same air as my family." And then she raised her hand. It was a move that Doña Carmen had made before. Valentina knew it. She had seen it in the eyes of the other employees when they spoke of her in whispers in the kitchen. Doña Carmen wasn't the type to make threats. She was the type to act. And they did so with the calm certainty of someone who has never had to answer for their actions. Mrs. Carmen's hand traveled towards Valentina's face, and Valentina stopped it. It wasn't a sudden movement. It wasn't panic. It was something much more disturbing than that. It was precise, controlled, almost elegant. Valentina's hand rose and caught Mrs. Carmen's wrist halfway with a sense that froze the atmosphere in the room. Time stopped. Mrs. Carmen couldn't move, not because Valentina was stronger, but because she was completely paralyzed by astonishment. In 61 years of life, no one, absolutely no one, had dared to stop her hand. Valentina looked her straight in the eyes. "No," she said, a single word, calm, without hatred, without fear. And that word, spoken with that calm, was more devastating than any scream. Wama. The entire room seemed to have turned into a painting. 400 people motionless, champagne glasses half raised, conversations cut short in mid-syllable. The musicians of the orchestra had stopped of touching without anyone asking them to. All that could be heard was the soft crackling of the candles, and from somewhere far away in the mansion, the wind blowing through a poorly closed window. Rodrigo Villanueva saw it all. He was standing by the bar in the back, with a glass of whiskey in his hand that he no longer remembered holding. He was 38 years old, with a square jaw, a black Giorgio Armani suit, and the same dark eyes as his mother, although with a completely different expression. He was a man used to making decisions in seconds, to reading situations, with the speed required to manage a corporation with 10,000 employees. And at that moment, what he was reading did not fill him with pride. His mother, his company, his party, his silence. Doña Carmen slowly took her hand back as if she were removing it from something that was burning it. Her face had gone from furious red to an unsettling pallor. "We'll see," she said in a very low voice, just for Valentina. "We'll see how long that little face lasts." He turned to the guests with a smile reconstructed so quickly it seemed like a magic trick. "Excuse the interruption," he said, in his usual perfectly modulated voice. "These things happen when you don't hire the right staff. Please continue to enjoy your evening." And the orchestra, as if on cue, picked up the music again. The conversation resumed at first in murmurs, then at its usual volume. Glasses were raised again. Canapes were passed around, and the world kept spinning. Valentina stood still in the center of the room for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up the tray from the floor, placed the fallen glass on it, which miraculously hadn't broken, and continued her walk among the guests as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Everyone knew it. Rodrigo Villanueva put his glass of whiskey down on the bar without touching it, and followed with his gaze the woman who walked among her guests with her back perfectly straight, her head slightly raised, and a serenity that did not correspond to someone who had just been publicly humiliated. She did not correspond, Rodrigo thought, to any maid he had ever met. What he did not yet know What none of the 400 guests gathered under the crystal chandeliers of his mansion could even suspect was that Valentina Cruz had arrived at that house exactly for this moment, not the moment of humiliation, but the moment after. The Maid with Secrets. 3 months before that night, Valentina Cruz had crossed the service gate of the Villa Unwavering mansion with a black canvas suitcase, white tennis shoes, with the soles peeling off at the toes, and an impeccably forged resume. The document stated that her name was Valentina Cruz Mendoza, that she was 26 years old, that she was originally from Tlihuac, that she had worked for 3 years as a maid in a 4-star hotel in the Doctores neighborhood, and that in her free time she took cooking classes. All that was a lie, except for her age and first name. The rest was a careful construction that had taken 4 months to plan. The mansion's chief of staff, a middle-aged woman named Graciela Reyes, had received her in a small office next to the service kitchen. Graciela had the air of someone who had seen hundreds of employees pass by and had long since stopped finding them interesting. She looked at her over her bifocals, reviewed her resume, asked 3 routine questions about experience with the China and handling high-profile clients, and told her that the salary was 8,000 pesos every 2 weeks, that Sundays were her days off, and that Mrs. Carmen had certain rules that were followed without exception or question. Bisobod. Any questions? Graciela asked. None, Valentina replied. Fine, she starts on Monday. What Graciela didn't know, what no one in that mansion knew in the following 3 months, was that Valentina had rejected a job offer that same year at a corporate law firm on Paseo de la Reforma, that she held a law degree from the Universidad Iberoamericana, which she had obtained with honors, that she had spent the last 18 months gathering information, making connections, and Choy Barisaringu, instructing a file that would have taken an entire prosecutor's office years to put together, and that the reason she was in that house with that duffel bag and those worn-out sneakers had a name. The name was Mrs. Carmen Eugenia Villanueva. The story began 6 years earlier, in an office in the Superior Court of Justice of the Federal District. Judge Ernesto Morales Cruz had spent 32 years in the federal judiciary with a reputation that was an almost scandalous rarity in that world. He was honest. Not the kind of honest who discreetly takes money under the table. He was honest, the kind who would give back too much change at the supermarket, and who would call his superiors when offered a bribe. He was the kind of man who in Mexico makes you both love and fear him, because you know he will never give in, and that in certain contexts is more dangerous than being corrupt. In November of that year, Judge Morales had received a case that no one wanted to touch, a civil lawsuit for corporate fraud against Villanueva Corporativo, filed by 3 minority shareholders who alleged that the company had diverted funds to foreign accounts, las accounts. The amounts were considerable, around 80 million pesos in transfers that appeared in the accounting books as strategic consulting expenses, but which the plaintiffs argued were not true, corresponded to no real service. The case came to Judge Morales almost by accident, reassigned 3 times before landing on his desk. He took it with the same calmness with which he took all his cases. He studied the file, requested additional documentation, scheduled hearings, and began to find things. What he found was not simply accounting fraud. It was a more elaborate structure, designed with the precision of someone who knows the boundaries of the law well and knows exactly how far he can cross it without leaving a trace. There was a shell company in the Cayman Islands, another in Luxembourg, and a third registered to a frontman in Panama. And behind those companies, hidden under 3 layers of intermediaries, was a name that the judge recognized immediately: Don Esteban Fuenteverde. Esteban Fuenteverde was what in certain circles was called, with a careful euphemism, a business with a presence in multiple sectors. He had stakes in construction companies, medical supply importers, a parking lot chain, and at least 2 regional media outlets. He also had, although this was not said aloud, well-documented ties, well-documented with corruption structures in 3 states of the Republic, what Judge Morales discovered, and that no one else had seen, because no one else had had the access or the patience to connect the dots. It was that Fuente Verde and Mrs. Carmen Villanueva had been operating together for more than a decade, not as open partners. There would never be any signed contract between them that could be found in a drawer, but as silent allies who shared profits through a network of transactions so well camouflaged that it seemed like statistical noise until one knew exactly what one was looking for. The plan was ambitious, and Judge Morales was the only real obstacle he had at that moment. On December 14, Ernesto Morales Cruz left his office at 9 at night, as he did every day when he had an important case. His driver was waiting for him in the courthouse parking lot. It was a 20-minute drive to his house in the Narvarte neighborhood. He never arrived. The official report said it was a traffic accident. The cargo truck that invaded the opposite lane on the ring road was driven by a man with a history of alcoholism who that night registered 3 times the legal alcohol limit in his car. Blood. The driver died instantly. The judge's driver was seriously injured. Judge Ernesto Morales Cruz died at the trauma hospital at 2 a.m. the following morning. Valentina was 20 years old when her father died. She was in her 3rd semester of law school when she received the call. It took her 2 hours to reach the hospital. By then, there was nothing left to be done. What she did find in her father's apartment 2 days later was something he had accidentally. A green folder with photocopies of the case documents, notes in his neat, tight handwriting, and a note in the margin that said, in pencil, with 2 question marks at the end, CB Carmen Villanueva, FV, Fuente Verde. It took Valentina 6 years to fully understand what those 2 initials meant. 6 years of studying, of getting a degree, of working in firms small enough that no one would pay attention to her while she built her case, of learning exactly how the financial structures that the wealthy use to hide what they don't want seen work may. And when she had had enough, when the file she had built was solid enough that no judge in the world could ignore it, she made a decision that her 3 closest friends thought was crazy. She entered the mansion, not to file a complaint. Not yet. First, she needed the last links, internal documents that no outside lawyer would ever have access to. Correspondence, transfer records that would never make it to an official audit, the kind of evidence that only exists inside the house. So she became Valentina Cruz Mendoza Tlac Maid, with a forged resume and a capacity for patience that she had cultivated during 6 years of mourning turned into purpose. During her 3 months in the mansion, Valentina learned to navigate it as if it were her own. She knew everyone's schedules, including what time Doña Carmen woke up when Mr. Rodrigo took his business calls and the exact moments when the study on the 1st floor was left completely empty. He knew which drawers of which desks were locked and which weren't. She knew that Doña Carmen kept her private correspondence in a lacquered wooden box in the 2nd right drawer of her dresser, and that the password for the house's administrative Wi-Fi, different from the one used by the staff, was Rodrigo Villanueva's birthday. She had photographed more than 300 pages of documents with a phone she kept in the false bottom of her apron pocket. She had overheard 3 of Mrs. Carmen's phone conversations without anyone knowing she was overhearing them, which would have been enough on their own to open a formal investigation. She knew that Esteban Fuenteverde visited the mansion once a month, always on Tuesdays, always after 10 at night, and always with a folder that he took untouched when he left. What she hadn't counted on was the anniversary party. She hadn't counted on Mrs. Carmen choosing her, specifically her, to unleash her public humiliation on that night. He hadn't counted on the instinct she had developed over 6 years of controlled rage to make her hand rise to stop the slap before her mind could finish reasoning it out. But it happened. And now, as she walked among the guests with the silver tray and her back perfect, straight, Valentina knew that time had run out. Doña Carmen was not going to forget that moment. Doña Carmen was going to act. What Valentina needed to do before that happened was to hand the documents to someone with enough power to use them. Her eyes traveled involuntarily to the back of the room where Rodrigo Villanueva was still standing by the bar with his untouched glass, looking at her with an expression that Valentina did not know how to classify. It was not the look of a man who had seen an insolent maid. It was the look of someone who had just seen something he did not understand and needed to understand. Valentina looked away. Not yet. It was not yet the time for Rodrigo Villanueva, but it was very close. The man who did not see the party ended after 1 in the morning. The last guest left amidst prolonged farewells and promises of meetings that would probably never happen. The waiters began to collect the glasses, fold the linen tablecloths, and blow out the candles one by one until the room, which 2 hours before had been the center of the world, it became a huge, silent space that smelled of champagne and melted wax. Valentina was in the service kitchen washing trays when Rodrigo Villanueva entered. He didn't announce his arrival. He simply appeared in the doorway with his suit jacket folded over his arm, the top button of his shirt undone, and an expression on his face that Valentina recognized immediately because she had studied it for 3 months. It was the expression Rodrigo Villanueva wore when something didn't add up, and his mind was working to figure out why. Valentina kept washing. "Valentina," he said. "Mr. Villanueva." She didn't turn around. There was a pause. Rodrigo entered the kitchen, left the jacket on one of the stools at the central bar, and stood with his arms crossed, watching her work. "What happened tonight has begun again." "It's over," Valentina said. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes." Her voice was calm but firm, the voice of someone who wasn't used to being interrupted. "My mother acted in a way that wasn't acceptable." Valentina stopped washing for a moment, then continued. "Are you going to defend me, sir?" he asked without irony, with a neutrality so perfect that it was almost impossible to know what was behind it. 4 hours later, when no one was watching, the silence that followed was long. Rodrigo did not respond because he had no answer. He was an intelligent man, and intelligence in this case meant knowing exactly how true that question was. "I need to ask you to submit your resignation," he said, finally. "Effective tomorrow. Of course, you will receive 3 months severance pay. Nadizio. Okay?" Rodrigo paused. He didn't expect that. "Okay?" he repeated. "Yes." Valentina turned off the water, dried her hands on a dish towel, and turned to look at him for the first time since he had come in. She looked at him directly and unhurriedly, the same way she had looked at him for 3 months without him noticing. "I will submit my resignation first thing tomorrow morning to Mrs. Graciela." He paused. "But before I go, I would like to leave you something." She went to the small personal locker she had in the utility room on the first floor. Rodrigo waited for her in the kitchen, and she returned 90 seconds later with a letter, sized manila envelope with no name or address written on the outside. Sealed with a strip of tape, she placed it on the bar in front of him. "What is this?" Rodrigo asked without touching it. "Documents," Valentina said. "I recommend that you read them tonight." She took her apron, folded it carefully over the back of the bench, and headed toward the exit of the kitchen. "Good evening, Mr. Villanueva." Rodrigo watched her walk away down the service corridor until her footsteps were lost in the silence of the mansion. Then he looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it for a full 4 minutes. He simply stared at it with that expression that his CFO described as the face a man makes when he's about to discover something he's not going to like. Then he picked it up, opened it, and began to read it standing in the empty kitchen while outside the waiters finished cleaning the dining room. It took him 40 minutes to read everything. When he finished, he left the papers on the bar, went to the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, opened it, looked at it and closed it without taking a single sip. The documents were copies of internal transfers from Villanueva Corporate to a company called ABCSA Strategic Consulting, DCB, with an RFC registered 4 years ago at a notary's office in Monterey. Copies of service contracts that described in perfectly written technical language consulting services that had never occurred, and, at the end, a sheet with a 12- line table that showed with dates, amounts, and account numbers the history of 43 million pesos that had left his company's coffers. Ian had estate these coffers in 3 years and had never returned. The signature on most of the authorization documents was his mother's. Rodrigo Villanueva spent the rest of that night without sleeping. At 3 in the morning, he was in his office, with the documents spread out on his desk and his laptop open, verifying on his own what the papers said. He had access to the company's accounting systems with his CEO password, and what he found confirmed each line of the table. And Strategic Consulting, ABCSA Day, the CBI, existed in the Public Registry of Commerce. It had a fiscal address in Monterey, on a street that Rodrigo searched for on Google Maps, and which turned out to be a rented commercial space of 3 square meters next to a taco shop. The legal representative was a man named General Bustamante Rios, about whom Rodrigo found absolutely nothing in any search, which in itself was already an answer. It was not a company. It was a shell, a paper address behind which the money disappeared to some place that the documents he had failed to show. He had failed. 43 million pesos. Rodrigo Villanueva had built the second phase of his company's expansion with 30 million of his own investment. 43 million was enough to have opened 2 more plants. It was enough to have increased the annual bonus of his entire operating plant for 2 years in a row. It was enough to have done a dozen things that he had not been able to do because the resources were not enough, and he had never understood exactly why. Now he understood. At 5 in the morning, he poured himself a whiskey that he also did not drink and called his corporate lawyer, Fernando Ibanez, on his personal cell phone. Fernando answered on the 4th ring in a sleepy voice. "I need you to come to the mansion at 8, Rodrigo said without preamble. "Bring your copy of the Articles of Incorporation and the latest internal audit report." "Rodrigo, it's 5 in the morning and 8, Fernando." He hung up. Then he stared at the phone for a moment and dialed another number. "This one, yes," he answered on the first ring, as if he were also awake. "Where is she?" Rodrigo asked. "Who?" the voice said on the other end. "The girl I just ran away from." A brief pause. It was his personal assistant, Mauricio, young and efficient, who had access to the files of all the employees in the house. "According to Graciela's file, she lives in the Guerrero neighborhood. I have an address. Do you want it?" Rodrigo wrote the address on the very margin of one of the documents in the manila envelope. Then he looked at it, crossed out what he had written, copied it onto a separate sheet, and carefully destroyed the document page. He did not want any of his notes to appear next to those papers until he understood exactly what he was looking at, and who else knew it. That precaution, which at another time would have seemed exaggerated, at this moment felt perfectly reasonable because Rodrigo Villanueva had spent the night reading documents that accused his mother of embezzling 43 million pesos from her own company, Gain, SOV Game, eh? And the source of those documents was a maid who had blocked the slap from his mother in front of 400 people with the calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment for months. Neither of those two things were normal, and Rodrigo Villanueva, who had built a corporation of 10,000 employees learning to distinguish between what it seemed and what it was, he knew with absolute certainty that behind that girl with the ironed apron and worn-out sneakers, there was something he still couldn't see. He needed to see it. When the sun began to peek over the hills in the west of the city, Rodrigo Villanueva was still in his study with the papers in front of him and a cup of coffee that someone had left at the door and that had gone cold without him noticing. Out somewhere in the mansion, he heard his mother's footsteps coming down the stairs to the breakfast room punctual, as always, as 6:30. He didn't go down to see her. It was the first time in 38 years that Rodrigo Villanueva hadn't come down to have breakfast with his mother when he was in the same house. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. No, there was a conscious decision. Her legs simply didn't move from where they were, and her mind, occupied with columns of numbers and names of shell companies, couldn't find any convincing reason to insist. What Carmen hides Rodrigo arrived at Villanueva's corporate offices at 7:40 in the morning, an hour before the first employee arrived. The headquarters occupied floors 16 through 21 of a glass tower on Reforma, 4 kilometers from the family mansion, La Yamihapi. Rodrigo had his own biometric access to the executive floor, and that morning he used it to enter the corporate archive on the 16th floor, which was where the physical copies of the contracts and business agreements from the last 10 years were kept. He searched for 40 minutes. What he found confirmed what Valentina's documents had suggested, but expanded on it in a way that left a strange taste in his mouth. It wasn't just ABC Strategic Consulting. There were 3 other companies with similar structures created at different times over the last 8 years, all with the same pattern, generic name, minimal tax address, legal representative without presence, public service contracts written in language that would convince a careless auditor, but which, when read twice, described nothing concrete. Achu swachu. The cumulative total for the 4 companies, adding up the payments for the last 8 years, exceeded 90 million pesos. Rodrigo closed the last folder, carefully returned it to its place, and sat in the filing cabinet chair for a moment, his hands flat on the table and his eyes fixed on the wall of gray shelves in front of him. 90 million. Then he went to his office on the 21st floor, closed the door, and spent the next 2 hours doing what he did better than anything else, buscus, tracking money. He had access to the accounting systems, yes, but the money that went into these shell companies disappeared from Villanueva Corporate's records the moment it left. To find out where it went next, he needed other information, and that information was not in their systems. He called a man named Aurelio Paz. Aurelio was officially financial risk consultant. Unofficially, he was the person in charge, and that businessmen of a certain level called when they needed to know things that were not in any public record. Rodrigo had hired him twice before. Once to verify the real solvency of a potential partner, another to investigate a case of internal theft at his Querétaro plant. Aurelio was discreet, expensive, and had never failed. I need to track the final destination of transfers that left my company for 4 companies. I'll send you the RFCs and the approximate amounts. A pause. This is urgent. How much time do I have? Aurelio asked. 72 hours. It's going to take longer. I don't care. Rodrigo hung up. It was 10 in the morning when Fernando Ibanez's corporate lawyer, arrived at the office with the articles of incorporation and the audit report under his arm, looking like someone who still doesn't understand why they called him at 5 in the morning. Rodrigo put the documents in the manila envelope on his desk without saying a word. Fernando read them. It took less time than Rodrigo, since Fernando was a lawyer and knew exactly where to look. When he finished, he looked up and said, probably took effort. Where did this come from? From someone on the inside? From whom? I still don't know. It was definitely a lie, but Rodrigo wasn't ready to tell anyone where the documents had come from, not until he understood why a maid had access to information that he himself hadn't been able to see. What I need to know is if this is enough for a formal complaint. Fernando thought about it for 10 seconds. For a complaint to the anti-corruption prosecutor's office, yes, this can open a file, but you would need the final destination of the money for the case to move forward. Without that, the lawyers for the other side are going to argue that the transfers were legitimately contracted services and are going to demand that you prove otherwise. I have the final destination in 72 hours. Fernando looked at him with an expression that was half admiration and half something that resembled fear. Rodrigo, do you know who this could be against? I have an idea. Is it someone in your family? Rodrigo didn't answer. Fernando nodded very slowly, as if he had just confirmed something he had hoped not to confirm. I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know, the lawyer said, before I can advise you properly. When I have the money's destination, I'll tell you everything. For now, I need you to prepare a full legal review of the contracts with those 4 companies. I want to know if there are any internal signatures that aren't on the documents by 8 documents. I want to know if the board of directors approved these expenses in any minutes, or if they skipped that step. They skipped that step? Fernando frowned. An expense of that size would have had to go through the finance committee. Exactly. Rodrigo stood up. Then start there. The 72 hours that Rodrigo had given Aurelio Peace turned into 48. Aurelio called at 6 p.m. the next day in a voice that had a tone that Rodrigo had never heard before, something that in anyone else would have recognized as discomfort. The money from all 4 companies goes to the same final place, Aurelio said. There are 2 intermediate jumps, one in Panama and one in Luxembourg, but the final destination is an account in the Cayman Islands, registered in the name of a private foundation. Name of the foundation? Palma Verde Foundation. A pause. Rodrigo. That foundation has a second registered beneficiary in addition to the owner, and that second beneficiary is a natural person. Who? Esteban Fuenteverde. The name fell into the conversation like a stone in still water. Rodrigo knew that name. Everyone in certain business circles in Mexico knew that name, although no one said it too often or too loudly. Esteban Fuenteverde was one of those men who accumulate power in a way that is never fully visible, like an underwater current that you can only detect when it is already dragging you away. What Rodrigo did not know, what none of his company's documents had revealed to him, what Aurelio was telling him now in that slightly uncomfortable voice, was that Fuenteverde and his mother were co-owners of a private foundation in the Cayman Islands which had received 90 million pesos from Villanueva Corporativo in 8 years. His company, his money, the company that his father had built with 30 years of work and that he had tripled in size in the following decade. Is there anything else? Rodrigo asked. His voice sounded perfectly normal, which was a considerable achievement in itself. Yes. Another pause. Fuenteverde has a meeting scheduled with the notary who handles the Villanueva corporate bylaws for next Thursday. I don't know the content of the meeting, but the notary is the same one who drafted the articles of incorporation for 2 of the 4 shell companies. Rodrigo hung up the phone, stood in the center of his office, staring blankly at the city flickering through the glass of the window, and understood with a clarity that hurt in a specific and difficult-to-describe way what was happening. This wasn't just accounting fraud. This wasn't just his mother skimming money from the company for reasons he might have attributed to greed or someone's whim, accustomed to having everything she wanted. It was a plan. Puente Verde and his mother had been systematically draining Villa Nueva corporate more for 8 years, and next Thursday's meeting with the notary who had created the shell companies was not a coincidence. It was the next step in something that Rodrigo still didn't see in its entirety, but whose outlines were beginning to emerge with a precision that made his stomach shiver, completely unrelated to the temperature of the air conditioning in his office. They were preparing something related to the legal structure of the company, something that, if it happened on Thursday, would be much more difficult to reverse. Rodrigo looked at his watch. It was 6:30 in the evening, and then he thought about Valentina for the second time in 2 days. Because what he had just discovered with 48 hours of urgent research and an expensive consultant paid at emergency prices was exactly what she had given him in a manila envelope sealed with adhesive tape in an empty kitchen at 1 in the morning after 3 months of washing trays in her house. She knew everything before he did. She knew it, and she hadn't reported it directly. He hadn't gone to the prosecutor. She hadn't leaked to the press. She had gone into his house, waited, and given him the documents. Why? Why him? Why in that way? What did she have to gain by having Rodrigo specifically receive that information? First thought, the questions lined up in his mind like dominoes, each one pushing the next. And the answer to the last question in the chain was the one that made him grab his jacket from the back of his chair, turn off his laptop screen, and leave the office without telling anyone where he was going. He had an address written down on a loose sheet of paper in the inside pocket of his jacket. Colonia Guerrero needed answers, and the only person who had them was a woman who, according to the clock, had no longer been his employee for exactly 36 hours. The truth has a name. Colonia Guerrero was not the kind of place where men in Giorgio Armani suits and the latest model black Audi showed up at 7 in the evening without attracting attention. Rodrigo knew it. He knew it, and yet he turned onto Moctezuma Street, following the instructions on his GPS with the same concentration with which he would have entered any difficult negotiation, without hesitation, without looking around, with the expression of someone who didn't belong there. His eyes fixed on the number he was looking for. It was a 4-story building with a faded ochre facade, green bars on the windows on the first floor, and a blacksmith shop on the ground floor, which was already closed at that hour. There was no name on the mailbox for apartment 3B, just a piece of masking tape with the letters BC written in black pen. He went up the stairs and knocked. There was silence on the other side that lasted just long enough for someone to look through the peephole. And there was the sound of 2 bolts being clicked, and the door opened. Valentina was wearing ordinary clothes for the first time since Rodrigo had known her. Gray pants, a navy blue t-shirt, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders. Without her uniform, without the bun, without the silver tray, she looked simultaneously younger and more serious. Her eyes scanned him from top to bottom in a fraction of a second, with a speed that was not that of a maid, assessing whether the master needed anything. It was the speed of someone assessing a threat. "Mr. Villanueva," he said, and his voice held neither surprise nor welcome. It was just a matter of fact. "I need to talk to you." "I know." She stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small, but tidy with a precision that Rodrigo recognized as intentional. It wasn't the order of someone who has few belongings, but the order of someone who has chosen to have only what is necessary. A table with 2 chairs, a laptop, 3 stacks of books lined up with millimeter precision on the only bookcase. On the wall, a corkboard with papers held together with colored thumbtacks, and Rodrigo had to make a conscious effort not to go over and read them. Valentina didn't offer him a seat. She stood by the table with her arms crossed, looking at him. I found out where the money was going, Rodrigo said without preamble. Ubare, Palma Verde Foundation, Cayman Islands, 90 million in 8 years. He paused. How much did you know? All that and more. How much more? Valentina looked at him for a moment, then went to the bookcase, pulled out a green hardcover folder, and he put it on the table between them. Sit down, he said. Rodrigo, he sat down. Valentina opened the folder. What Rodrigo listened to for the next hour was a story that he knew in parts and had never seen in its entirety. Valentina spoke without notes, with the fluidity of someone who has gone over every detail thousands of times until it becomes something that cannot be forgotten even if one wanted to. She spoke in a calm voice, without raising her voice, without dramatic gestures, as if she were presenting a case in court, which was exactly what she had prepared for. She told him about Judge Ernesto Morales Cruz. She told him about the case that had reached her father's desk in November, 6 years ago, a corporate fraud lawsuit against the Villanueva Corporativo filed by 3 minority shareholders whose names Rodrigo recognized immediately because 2 of them were still on the board of directors of his company, B. She told him what her father had found. The companies in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, the front man in Panama, and the 2 initials in pencil in the margin of his notes that had taken 6 years to become certain. She told him about the 14th of December, of the peripheral, of the cargo truck, of the driver who had 3 times the blood alcohol limit and who died instantly, which meant he would never speak, which had taken Valentina years to understand was not a coincidence but a solution. When she finished, the department was silent. Rodrigo had his elbows on the table and his hands clasped in front of his mouth, and he stared at the open folder without really seeing the pages in front of him. Your father, he finally said. Yes. And do you think my mother ordered? I have documentation that establishes communication between Mrs. Carmen and Esteban Fuenteverde in the 10 days prior to the accident. Valentina's voice did not change. It was the tone of someone who has learned to refer to her own pain with the language of facts, because it is the only way to continue talking about it. I have records of 2 transfers, from a personal account of Fuenteverde to a private security company that was dissolved 4 months after the accident. And I have the testimony of a witness who witnessed the truck driver meet with a known intermediary from Fuenteverde at a bar in a Carape 48 hours before the accident. A witness. Where is this protected? Witness. For the first time since she began speaking, something crossed Valentina's face that wasn't just professional coldness. It was something older and harder to name. That's the first thing I ascertained before entering her house. Rodrigo looked at her. How long have you been building this? 6 years. Alone. The weight of those 2 words filled the space between them in a way that required no further comment. Rodrigo leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at her. Why did you give it to me? He asked. You had enough to go to the prosecutor's office directly. Why come into my house? Why wait 3 months? Why the envelope to me? Valentina held his gaze. Because an anonymous complaint against Mrs. Carmen Villanueva without the support of the general director of Villanueva, Corporate E, is filed in 3 weeks. He said, I've seen it happen. Fuenteverde has ties to common law prosecutors and 1 federal prosecutor. Without someone with your clout pushing from the inside, the case dies before it reaches a judge. A pause. You're a clout maker. And you needed me to come to these conclusions. Just so I didn't feel like I was humoring you. I needed you to have your own reasons for acting, Valentina corrected. Mine are personal. Yours are your company, your name, your assets. With those reasons, you don't stop. With mine, you could have decided it wasn't your problem. Rodrigo looked at her for a long moment. If I had decided to cover for my mother, I wouldn't. I wouldn't have done it. How can you be sure? Because I've been watching her for 3 months, Valentina said, with a simplicity that was almost more disturbing than any elaborate argument. And because men who cover for their mothers don't spend entire nights in the corporate archives checking every number on their own before calling anyone. Rodrigo didn't answer. Outside, on the street, a truck trash rolled by with its usual clang of metal and engine. And for one absurd moment, that was all that existed. The sound of the truck, the green folder on the table, and 2 people sitting across from each other in a small apartment in the Guerrero neighborhood, each carrying the weight of something the other was only just beginning to understand. The notary's meeting is on Thursday, Rodrigo said. I know. Do you know what they're going to do? My hypothesis, Valentina said, is a transfer of share control. Fuente Verde has enough already to argue a silent, majority shareholder position if they can get the notary to certify documents supporting that position. They need to do it before any internal audit exposes them because once legal control of the company is in dispute, a recovery process takes years. She looked at him squarely. Years in which Fuente Verde can operate. Rodrigo processed that for 10 seconds. You have 4 days, he said. Oui, Valentina corrected. The word fell between them without fuss, as if it were the natural continuation of something that had already been decided before either of them had said it out loud. Rodrigo looked at her. Valentina looked at him. And in that small, tidy apartment in the Guerrero neighborhood, with a green folder on the table, and 4 days before something irreversible would happen, something changed between them that still had no name, but that they both felt with the same clarity with which one feels the exact moment when a door closes behind you. There was no turning for either of them. The trail has the face of a mother. It took Doña Carmen Eugenia Villanueva exactly 1 day to find out that her son had visited the former maid's apartment in the Guerrero neighborhood, not because Rodrigo was being followed by someone, not yet, but because the driver who had driven him that afternoon was a man named Primitivo Sanchez, who had been driving for the Villanueva family for 18 years and whose loyalty, like that of several employees of the mansion, had been bought by Doña Carmen with discreet raises and opportune favors that never appeared on any payroll. Primitivo sent her a message that same night. Address, arrival time, departure time, 1 hour and 20 minutes in. Doña Carmen read the message sitting at her dressing table, in front of the mirror, while her personal stylist undid her party hair. Her expression didn't change. She thanked the stylist, said goodbye, waited for her footsteps to recede down the corridor, and then picked up her personal phone. It wasn't the same one she used to call Rodrigo or her friends, the one with a SIM card registered to a corporate telephone company that didn't exist, and she dialed a number she knew by heart. "We have a problem," she said when they answered. The voice on the other end was Esteban Fuenteverde's. Not the Fuente Verde who appeared on the social pages or on the boards of directors of his law firms. This was the Fuente Verde of 11 at night, without the veneer of manners, direct and cold as the edge of something very well sharpened. Rodrigo went to see her. A 3-second pause. How long had he been there? More than an hour. Another, longer silence. How much do you think she knows? That's all, said Mrs. Carmen. And for the first time in many years there was something in her voice that wasn't exactly fear, but that was dangerously close. Esteban, that girl is not a maid. I was with her for 3 months under the same roof and I didn't see it coming. And that doesn't happen to me. She has something, she knows something. And if Rodrigo is sitting and listening to her for an hour in her apartment, it's because what she has is enough for him to listen to her. What do you want to do? What is always done when someone knows too much, said Mrs. Carmen. Neutralize her, but be careful, we can't afford for her to look like what she is. Do you have any idea where she keeps what she has? No, but I know how to find out. The next day, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. The first, Rodrigo called his law firm and requested an urgent and confidential review of Villanueva's corporate bylaws with explicit instructions to identify any clauses that could be used to alter the shareholding structure without the CEO's approval. Without the CEO's approval. Fernando Ibanez, who had worked for Rodrigo for enough years to know when something was very serious, canceled his entire day and locked himself in with 2 associates to work on it. The second, Mrs. Carmen called a meeting at the mansion with the administrator of the private security company that ran the mansion, a man named Gardio, under the pretext of reviewing access protocols after the anniversary party. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. What was agreed upon at the meeting was never put in writing. That same afternoon, Valentina left the apartment at 5 a.m. to go to the stationery store on the corner to print 3 documents, but that she needed for the meeting she would have with Rodrigo the next day. It took her 22 minutes. When she returned, the apartment door was locked exactly as she had left it. Both keys worked without any problems, and everything seemed to be in its place. It took her 4 minutes to realize that it was missing. It was the drawer of the bookcase, the bottom one. The one that closed with a small combination lock that looked like the kind of cheap accessory that no one would take seriously. The drawer was closed, the combination was set, but the microscopic mark that Valentina had made with a pencil line on the edge of the drawer a precaution. She had learned from her father, and that seemed excessive to her until now it no longer seemed excessive, was not where it should have been. It was 3 millimeters higher. Someone had opened that drawer. Valentina stood still in the middle of the apartment for a full 10 seconds. Then he went methodically from room to room, checking every object, every drawer, every space that could have been opened or moved. What he found was what he expected, nothing obvious. It was the work of someone with experience, someone who knew how to search a place without leaving a trace visible to the ordinary eye. But the bookcase drawer told him that they had been there. The bookcase drawer also told him something more important, what we're looking for, because that drawer contained, among other things, a copy of the testimony of his protected witness with real name, in Moody, in a sealed envelope that Valentina kept there as an emergency physical backup. He sat down in the chair in front of the table and called Rodrigo. They searched my apartment. A silence. When? Less than an hour ago. I know what they were looking for and they didn't find it in the drawer, but now they know that I have a witness with a name. A pause. And I know who this is from. How can you know this so quickly? Because it's exactly what I would do if I were in his shoes, Valentina said. And because I spent 6 years studying how his mother thinks. Rodrigo processed that. Are you sure the witness is protected? Yes. The name on that envelope is not the real name the lawyer in Guadalajara has in his possession. It was a frown. A brief pause. But that means that Mrs. Carmen is already acting, and that means she knows that time is up. Thursday is in 3 days, Rodrigo said. Aye, Valentina. His voice changed slightly, and that was a clue in itself, because Rodrigo Villanueva was a man who rarely let his voice change. You need to get out of that apartment. I'm not gonna. It's not a suggestion. This was said with a firmness that was not abruptness, but the voice of someone who has made up his mind and has no intention of debating it. If they entered once, they will return. And next time, they won't look for papers. Valentina fell silent. It was the first time in 6 years that someone had told her to be careful, and that those words had come from someone with enough weight to back them up with something more than good intentions. There was a strange feeling, not an unpleasant one. I have a sister, Valentina said after a moment. Lucia. Liz is 19 years old. She studies at UNAM. She lives in Tlatelolco. Does she know anything about all this? Nothing. I've kept her completely out of the loop for 6 years. A pause. But if they know I exist, they'll know she exists. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes a decision. Send her address to my phone, Rodrigo said. I'll send someone I trust to check on her, and you pack what you need. You're staying somewhere else tonight. What neither of them knew yet was that Mrs. Carmen had already taken another step. While Rodrigo was talking to Valentina on the phone from his office on Reforma, and while Valentina was packing a backpack with the most critical documents in her apartment in the Guerrero neighborhood, two men who were not employees of any registered company followed Lucia Morales Cruz from the Tlatelolco subway exit to the entrance of her building on Manuel Gonzalez Street. They didn't go in, they just watched. That night, Mrs. Carmen received a photo of Lucia from behind entering the building. Blue backpack, hair tied back, 22 steps from the subway door to the gate of her building. She looked at it for a moment, then saved it on her phone without answering. It was enough for now. It was enough so that when the time came, she would have something to use. What Mrs. Carmen Villanueva had never understood about the people she underestimated, what she had never finished learning in 61 years of life, was that people who have lost everything once are not as afraid as those who have never lost anything. And Valentina Cruz had lost everything at age 20 on the ring road at 2 a.m. He had nothing left to lose, only what she had built over the course of 6 years to get here. And that, contrary to what Mrs. Carmen calculated, did not make her more vulnerable. It made her more dangerous. Rodrigo crossed the line. Rodrigo's call to his mother came at 10 at night. Mrs. Carmen listened to him on the phone with that calculated serenity she had perfected over decades, this same one she used in board meetings when someone questioned one of her decisions, the same one she had used in front of 400 guests when she put her smile back together in 2 seconds after Valentina stopped her hand. Valentina. Rodrigo, my love, she said, and her voice was exactly the same as always, soft, slightly condescending, with that specific warmth that mothers of a certain type use as a tool. Has. I've been waiting for you to come by for breakfast. Graciela said you didn't sleep at the mansion last night. I didn't sleep there because I had work, Rodrigo said. His voice was completely flat, without warmth, without coldness, without anything that could be read. I need you to come to the offices tomorrow at 10 a.m. There are business matters that I need to review with you. A microscopic pause on the other end. Business matters? You can tell me over the phone? These aren't things that require us to review documents together. I'll see you at 10. Another pause. Mrs. Carmen was calculating. Rodrigo knew this, just as he calculated when he needed to decide how much to show and how much to keep. Of course, my love, she finally said. I'll be there at 10. All good? Everything perfectly good, Rodrigo said. Good night, Mom. He hung up. He stared at the phone for a moment and then typed a message to Valentina. That's it. She's coming tomorrow at 10. Are the notary's documents ready? The answer came in 40 seconds. Ready since yesterday. I also have something else I found tonight. I need to show you. What did you find? The minutes of Thursday's meeting. Someone leaked them. Rodrigo. They're going to do a fiduciary session, not a shareholder session. It's harder to reverse. The lawyers have to be there tomorrow. Rodrigo reread the message twice. A fiduciary session was exactly the kind of move that could be completed in hours if all the participants agreed, and that could take years to undo in court if it had already been certified. It meant it was cleaner, faster and harder to attack than outright shareholder fraud. It was, he thought, a smart move, which meant that whoever had designed it was someone who knew very well the system he was trying to use, and that someone was not his mother, who understood power and money but not legal architecture. That someone was Fuente Verde, or someone who worked for Fuente Verde. Tell him he needs to be at the offices tomorrow at 9 with the entire team. Don't explain why yet. Just tell him, the answer is urgent. I already did that 10 minutes ago. Rodrigo put his phone away and looked at the ceiling. There was something about Valentina that disturbed him, and it wasn't distrust. It was almost the opposite. It was the precision with which she anticipated every move. The way she had already laid out the pieces he was just beginning to see. It was a new feeling for him. Someone who had spent his adult life being the most prepared man in every room he stepped into, and now he discovered that there was someone who had spent 6 preparing for this, with a dedication that made his own standards seem casual. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was if he was honest with himself, something that was quite similar to respect. Doña Carmen arrived at the Reforma offices at 10 o'clock sharp, wearing a navy blue suit and a pearl necklace that Rodrigo remembered seeing in a photograph of his grandmother, and with the expression of someone who had come to an ordinary business meeting on a Tuesday morning. Rodrigo received her in the boardroom on the 21st floor. Fernando Ibanez was sitting on the right with 3 folders in front of him and 2 associates behind him. There were 2 other men Mrs. Carmen didn't recognize. A forensic accountant Fernando had contacted early that morning, and a trust law specialist who had flown in from Monterrey the night before. Mrs. Carmen took in the room in exactly 2 seconds. Her expression didn't change. "Wow," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Looks like an important meeting." "Have a seat, Mom." She sat down. Rodrigo didn't sit down. He stood at the front of the room with his hands in his pockets and spoke for 4 minutes without interruption, without raising his voice, without using a single unnecessary adjective. He explained what he had found. The $90 million. The 4 companies, the Palma Verde Fuente Verde Foundation, the notary's meeting scheduled for Thursday. When he finished, the silence in the room was the kind of silence that has texture. Doña Carmen looked at him for a long moment, then at Fernando, then at the men she didn't know, then back at Rodrigo, and then she did something Rodrigo didn't anticipate. She smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone who's giving up. It was the smile of someone who's been waiting for this moment and who's decided how he's going to play it. "My love," she said in a voice that dripped tenderness with the precision of an eyedropper. "I think someone's been lying to you, and I think I know exactly who." Rodrigo didn't answer. "That," Doña Carmen continued, and her voice changed just enough for the word "girl" to come out. "No sound." Sounded like something being picked up off the floor. "That made you insist on seeing. Do you know who sent her? Do you know who she really works for?" "Enlighten me," Rodrigo said. "Garza Pedrosa sent her." It was the name of Villanueva Corporate's biggest competitor in the industrial sector, a man with whom Rodrigo had had 3 legal disputes in 10 years. "Rodrigo, that woman is a corporate spy. Those documents she gave you were fabricated. Garza Pedrosa has been trying to destabilize our company for years, and now she's found a way to instill doubt in you about your own family." The room fell silent. Rodrigo looked at his mother. She returned his gaze with absolute serenity, with the conviction of someone who has believed her own story, or if she hasn't believed it, has practiced it enough times for the difference to not matter. "Mom," Rodrigo said in the same flat voice as the night before. The forensic accountant sitting to your left spent the last 16 hours verifying each transfer against the SAT and banking system records. The documents were not fabricated. A pause. And Garza Pedrosa has been living in Madrid for 4 years for health reasons. He has not operated in Mexico since then. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. Mrs. Carmen did not move a muscle. I also know about Thursday, Rodrigo continued. Fiduciary assignment. The notary leaned forward slightly. You canceled the appointment this morning at 8, right? Before coming here? For the first time, something crossed Mrs. Carmen's face that was not calculated. It was a fraction of a second less. But Rodrigo saw her because he had spent 38 years learning to read that face, and because there were some things that not even Mrs. Carmen could fully control. This conversation, she said, recovering herself, returning to that third-rate voice, should be between you and me alone, not in front of employees. Fernando is not an employee. He is my lawyer, and everything that is said in this room is documented. Rodrigo straightened up. Mom, I have 2 options to offer you. The first, you remove Fuente Verde from the Palma Verde Foundation. Return the $90 million to the company within a period agreed upon with Fernando, and this matter will be resolved internally. The second, I will file a complaint with the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office before noon on Thursday with the entire file completed. Mrs. Carmen looked at him. Are you threatening me? Your mother? I'm giving you options, Rodrigo said. What's more than what you gave Judge Morales? The name fell into the room like a heavy object on the marble floor. Mrs. Carmen paled. It was the first time in Rodrigo's memory, in 38 years, that he had seen his mother pale. Where did you get that? You have until tomorrow at noon to give me your answer, Rodrigo said. Fernando will escort you out. He turned and left the room. In the hallway, he leaned his back against the wall for exactly 10 seconds with his eyes closed and his hands shaking slightly, which no one saw because no one was watching. Then he opened his eyes, adjusted his jacket, and went to his office to wait. What Rodrigo didn't know at that moment was that Mrs. Carmen, instead of going home from the Reforma offices, had gone directly to a hotel in Polanco where Esteban Fuente had a permanent suite, and that Fuente Verde, that same afternoon, had made a call to a number that consultant Aurelio Paz identified in less than 2 hours as belonging to a well-known intermediary of the same type of service that had been hired 6 years earlier for an accident on the Periférico. This time the target was not a judge. It was a 26-year-old woman with a 19-year-old sister in Tlatelolco. Rodrigo read Aurelio's message standing in the center of his office and felt something he didn't remember feeling in many years. A physical urgency, an acceleration. In his chest that wasn't exactly fear, but that felt a lot like it when mixed with something that, in another context, at another time, might have taken him longer to recognize. He called Valentina before she finished reading the entire message. Listen to me, he said when she answered. I need you to grab your sister and have both of you out of your apartments within the next 30 minutes. Open. Right now. Can you hear me? A silence of 2 seconds. What happened? 30 minutes, Valentina. I'll explain later. Can you do it? Yes. Good. One pause. I'm on my way. He hung up, grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, and walked quickly out of the office without telling anyone where he was going. He had crossed a line that morning in the boardroom when he had said Judge Morales' name in front of his mother. Now he was crossing another, and this time he had no intention of looking back. The night of the collapse, Lucia Morales Cruz was 19 years old. She was in her 3rd semester of biology at UNAM, and was the type of person who didn't know that danger existed until someone explained it to her patiently and with specific details. Valentina explained it to her on the way from Tlatelolco to the place where Rodrigo was waiting for them. A security department in the Polanco neighborhood that belonged to the company, and that Rodrigo had used before for executives visiting from other countries. Neutral, anonymous, with 2 different accesses and a reception that didn't register names. Lucia listened in silence, sitting in the back seat of the car that Rodrigo had sent for them, her blue backpack on her lap and her eyes gradually opening as her sister spoke like someone waking from a dream in which they thought they were comfortable and discovering that the room is completely different from what they remembered. Esal. How long have you been doing this? Lucia asked when Valentina finished. 6 years. 6 years. Lucia's voice had something that was half astonishment and half something much more complex. Okay. I was 13 when Dad died. And you took on Lucia's role? No, wait. Lucia let out a breath slowly. Okay, go on. Valentina didn't continue because they had already arrived. Rodrigo was in the apartment when they entered, his jacket off, for the first time in days, and an expression on his face that Valentina had learned to read in a very short time. It was the expression of someone who is simultaneously juggling more variables than any person should at 8 p.m. on a Wednesday. And who is Manu's? But who is it's taking a while? He saw Lucia and extended his hand. Rodrigo Villanueva. Lucia looked at him for a second with a frankness that lacked any veneer of social protocol. I know who you are, she said. He's gonna fix this? Let's fix it, Rodrigo said, with an emphasis on the "let's" that Lucia registered, and that made her nod once, as if deciding that was enough for now. The next few hours were the longest of the week. Valentina and Rodrigo worked at the dining room table of the apartment with folders spread out and laptops open, while Lucia slept in the back room, phone in hand and sleeping lighter than usual. Fernando Ibanez arrived at 10 at night with the corporate bylaws and the expression of someone who had slept 4 hours in the last 2 days and had decided that was enough. Aurelio Paz sent updates every 40 minutes. The first was that the 2 men who had followed Lucia the previous afternoon had returned to their building in Tlatelolco to 9 p.m. and found the apartment empty. The second, Fuente Verde, had left the hotel in Polanco at 11:30 a.m. in an unknown direction. The third arrived at 1 a.m., and Rodrigo read it first and then handed the phone to Valentina without saying anything. Mrs. Carmen had called her personal lawyer at 12 a.m. The call had lasted 42 minutes. Mrs. Carmen's lawyer was the same one who had represented Fuente Verde in 2 previous civil lawsuits. She was not calling to accept Rodrigo's terms. She was building her defense, which meant she had made up her mind. Valentina read the message, handed him back the phone and said, "So it's tomorrow?" "Yes," Rodrigo said, "it's tomorrow." The board meeting of Villanueva Corporate was not scheduled for that Thursday. Rodrigo called it at 7 in the morning with 3 hours notice, using the emergency protocol that the company's bylaws contemplated for situations that required immediate decisions by the board. It was a mechanism that had been used exactly twice in the history of the company. Once when the founder died, and another when a fire destroyed the Querétaro plant. But this was the third. The 7 members of the board of directors arrived on the 21st floor of the Reforma Tower between 9:15 and 105, with confused faces and coffee in hand, not knowing exactly why they were there, but with enough experience to know that when Rodrigo Villanueva called an emergency, it was worth showing up. Mrs. Carmen was not on the board of directors. She had never been formally on it. Her influence over the company had always operated through more informal channels, more difficult to document and more effective precisely because of that. That was about to change. At 10 o'clock, Rodrigo he entered the boardroom. Valentina followed him in. Several board members looked at her with slightly confused expression, mentally assessing who this woman with her hair tied back and the navy blue suit was, who clearly wasn't an attendee, but who they didn't recognize from any previous meetings either. Fernando Ibanez closed the door. "Good morning," Rodrigo said. "I appreciate you coming on such short notice. Guy, what I'm going to present to you this morning is why." He spoke for 20 minutes, using no euphemisms, none of the watered-down corporate jargon that's used in boardrooms when you want to say something difficult, without making it sound as difficult as it is. He said the numbers. He said the names. He said the dates. He put the documents in the center of the table and left them there so that anyone who wanted to could touch them, look at them, verify that they were real. When he finished, the room was silent. One of the board members, a 72-year-old man who had known Rodrigo's father and had been on the board for 28 years, who's the first to speak. "Where's Carmen?" he asked in a voice that wasn't accusatory, just that of someone who needed to understand the bigger picture. "She wasn't called to this meeting," Rodrigo said. "This is a board meeting. She's not part of it." Another silence. And Fuente Verde is currently being notified by the anti-corruption prosecutor's office, Fernando's, from his place to Rodrigo's right. The complaint was filed this morning at 8. They have the complete file. The room processed that for a moment. That seemed longer than it was. Then Rodrigo turned slyly and said, "I would like to introduce you to Miss Valentina Morales Cruz. She's a lawyer from the Iberoamericana, and she is the one who put together the case that you have just seen over the last 6 years." A pause. She is also the daughter of Judge Ernesto Morot Cruz, whose name many of you will remember because he was the judge who received the first complaint against this company 6 years ago, and who died before he could resolve it. The silence that followed was of a kind that Valentina had not experienced before. It was not the uncomfortable silence of a company boardroom watching a scandal. It was something more like the silence of people who have just understood something that had been in front of them for a long time and that they had not seen. Valentina spoke for 10 minutes. She spoke in the same voice that she had used in the apartment in the Guerrero neighborhood in front of Rodrigo, without Rigo, with the facts ordered with a precision that needed no embellishment. He presented the testimony of the protected witness, now in the possession of the prosecution. She presented the communication records between Mrs. Carmen and Fuente Verde in the days leading up to the accident. She laid out the chain of transfers from the Palma Verde Foundation to the middleman who had hired the truck driver. When she finished, the 72-year-old advisor looked at her for a long moment. "How old were you when your father died?" he asked. 20, Valentina said. The man nodded very slowly. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to say it. At 12:15, while the board meeting was still going on the 21st floor, two of the board members' phones received a notification from a news agency almost simultaneously. Breaking. Anti-corruption prosecutor's office confirms arrest of businessman Esteban Fuenteverde in joint operation. Case linked to corporate fraud and investigation for intentional homicide. The room found out in 30 seconds. Rodrigo read the notification on his phone and then looked at Valentina, who was sitting 2 chairs to his left. She had already read it. He didn't say anything. He just put the phone down on the table with a slowness that had something definitive about it, like someone closing a book they've been reading for a long time. At 1 p.m, Mrs. Carmen Villanueva was arrested at the Las Lomas mansion by 2 agents from the prosecutor's office who arrived with a warrant signed by a federal judge. Rodrigo learned about it from a call from Mauricio while he was still in the offices. He hung up the phone and stared out the 21 St. Floor window at the city, spread out below, with the midday sun bouncing off the windows of the Reforma buildings. Then he turned around. Valentina was standing by the door to the conference room, the green folder under her arm and her posture the same as always. Her back straight, her head slightly raised. That's serenity that wasn't coldness, but something more like calm, of someone who has arrived at the place they've been headed to for a long time and is still processing that they've actually arrived. Their eyes met. Rodrigo didn't say anything. Neither did Valentina. But in that silence there was something that they both understood with the same clarity with which things that don't need words to exist are understood. The rules that she did changed. 6 months after that afternoon on the 21st floor of the Reforma Tower, Mexico City woke up to news on the front page of 3 of the country's leading newspapers. It wasn't the news of Mrs. Carmen's arrest, which had been published for 5 months already, and that had circulated for weeks with the intensity of scandals involving families with a well-known last name. Nor was it the case of Fuenteverde, whose process in the anti-corruption prosecutor's office had advanced with unusual speed that the businessman's lawyers attributed to political pressure, and that the prosecutors attributed to the fact that the file was, in the words of the head of the agency at a press conference, the most complete we have received in this administration. That morning's news was different. Federal judge reinstates the name of Judge Ernesto Morales Cruz and acknowledges irregularities in the investigation of his death. The ruling, issued by the Superior Court of Justice, established that the original investigation into the magistrate's death had been conducted with serious deficiencies and deliberate omissions, which ordered the reopening of the file, with new evidence presented by the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office in the framework of the Fuenteverde Villanueva case. Judge Morales Cruz was recognized by the ruling as an official who had acted and professional courage in investigating a case that his superiors had rejected. Valentina read the news 3 times. She was sitting at the table in the breakfast bar of an apartment in the Roma neighborhood that she had rented 2 months ago, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing, and the phone resting on the table in front of her. It took her a moment to realize that she was crying. It wasn't the crying of someone who's breaking down. It was the other kind of crying that comes when something you've been carrying around for a long time finally finds a place to rest. And the body, which didn't know it was waiting for that permission, takes it without apology. She stayed like that for a while. Then she wiped her face, drank the cold coffee, and called Lucia. Lucia answered on the second ring with the voice of someone who was already awake but hadn't gotten out of bed. "I saw it," she said before Valentina could say anything. "Are you okay?" "I am." Pause. "I'm fine. What about you?" "Yes." Another silence, of the kind that occurs between people who have experienced the same thing from different places and who know that there's not much to add because everything has already been said. "Listen," Lucia said. "Do you think Dad knew something was going to happen?" Valentina thought about the green folder, the photocopies in her father's cramped handwriting, the 2 initials with 2 question marks at the end. "I think he knew he was in for something complicated," she said. "I don't think he knew how complicated it was." "Do you think he would be proud?" Valentina took a moment to answer. "Yes," she said, "but I also think she would have preferred it not to be necessary." Lucia let out a breath. "Me too," she said. They hung up without saying goodbye with words, which was the way sisters sometimes said more to each other than with any phrase. The legal proceedings against Mrs. Carmen Eugenia Villanueva and Esteban Fuenteverde had advanced on parallel tracks since the day of their arrest. Fuenteverde's case was the most qualified tax fraud, money laundering, criminal association, and the charge that had taken the longest to be formalized. But when it arrived, it fell under the weight of 6 years of evidence accumulated with surgical care, intentional homicide as an inducement. In the case of Judge Ernesto Morales Cruz, Fuenteverde's lawyer had tried 5 different defense strategies in 6 months. The first was to deny any connection with Mrs. Carmen beyond an ordinary business relationship. The second was to argue that the Palma Verde Foundation documents were forgeries. The third was to point out that the protected witness was a bought witness. The fourth was to request the nullification of the case due to irregularities in obtaining it. The fifth is negotiating a plea deal with the prosecution for additional information. None of them worked. The protected witness turned out to be a former employee of the private security company hired for the accident on the ring road with immigration records, verifiable employment history, and a statement that matched every detail of the transfer records that Valentina had spent years reconstructing. He was not a bought witness. He was a man who had been carrying a burden for 6 years, and when someone offered him protection in exchange for talking, he talked. Mrs. Carmen's case was different in tone, but not in destination. Her lawyer had opted for a strategy of distance. Carmen did not know. Carmen signed what was presented to her without understanding the implications. Carmen was a society woman with no financial training who had placed too much trust in a man who turned out to be a criminal. It was a narrative designed for a specific jury profile, but the problem was that Mexico had no jury, and the federal judge who was hearing the case was exactly the kind of judge that Judge Morales Cruz had been, the type who returns too much change at the supermarket, Anchit. Mrs. Carmen's sentence came on a Tuesday morning. 8 years in prison for aggravated corporate fraud and complicity in intentional homicide. Her personal assets were seized. Her informal but documented participation in the decisions of Villanueva Corporate was declared null and void. Rodrigo was not in court on the day of the sentencing. Valentina, yes, she didn't go to celebrate. It was because for 6 years that room, that moment, had been the horizon she had walked towards, and it seemed to her that not going would have been a kind of lack of respect for everything she had walked to get there. She sat in the gallery with her hair loose and a navy blue dress and listened to the judge read the ruling with the same attention with which she had listened to every detail of this case for 6 years. When the judge finished, Valentina remained seated for a moment after the room began to empty. Her father's name had been pronounced by the judge 3 times during the reading of the ruling. 3 times with the same adjective in its entirety. That was enough. Rodrigo Villanueva had spent the following 6 months doing exactly what he knows how to do better than anything else, working. The company had needed a reconstruction that was not just financial. 90 million recovered in part through the seizure of the assets of the Palma Verde Foundation, in part through agreements with the banks that had intermediated the transfers and that preferred to negotiate, buffering in a second case. The 4 board members who had had some knowledge of the irregularities had resigned or been removed. Rodrigo had brought in 3 new board members, people chosen not for their last names or social connections, but for their credentials, for the way they had handled crises at other companies, for the quality of their decisions under pressure. The company was growing again, not in the way that something that has just been artificially inflated grows, but in the way that something that has been carefully pruned and now has room to expand where it should. The Querétaro plant, which had been idle for 3 years due to budget constraints, was back in operation in the month of April. The 140 employees who had been temporarily suspended returned with renewed contracts and a bonus that Rodrigo had calculated personally. It was the kind of decision his father would have made. It was also the kind of decision a man makes when he has been living under the shadow of something he cannot see, and when he finally does, decides that the only reasonable response is to build something that does not need shadows. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. It was a thick paper card with no letterhead or corporate logo, just Valentina's name handwritten on the front and inside. In a handwriting she would recognize in any context, because she had spent weeks reading documents written with the same precision of someone who learned to write so that the words would last. There's a board meeting next Tuesday at 10. I'd like you to be there. Not as a guest, but as part of it. Our Valentina read the card twice, then put it on the table and stared at it for a moment with an expression that Lucia, if she had been there, would have recognized immediately. It was the expression her older sister wore when she was finishing processing a decision she had already made. She called Rodrigo. He answered on the first ring. "Did you get it?" he asked. "Yes." And a pause. "Do you know what it means to put the daughter of the judge who investigated the fraud in your company on the board of directors of that same company?" Valentina asked. "Yes," Rodrigo said. "It means the rules have changed." Valentina was silent for a moment. Outside, on the street in the Roman neighborhood, the world went by with its usual noise. A truck, a child on a bicycle, someone selling something loudly from the sidewalk. The ordinary world that keeps turning beneath all the extraordinary stories that happen inside it. "Tuesday at 10, Valentina said finally. "Tuesday at 10, Rodrigo confirmed. Neither of them hung up right away. It was the kind of pause that wasn't uncomfortable, that didn't need to be filled, that existed simply because the two people on the other end of the phone were in the same place even if they were in different places, and neither of them was in a hurry to get out. The following Tuesday, at 9:58 in the morning, Valentina Morez Cruz arrived at the glass tower on Reforma. Not through the service entrance, not through the side entrance used by suppliers and couriers and people who came to deliver something and left without anyone remembering seeing them. She entered through the main door. The security guard in the lobby greeted her by name. The elevator to the executive floor accepted the new card that had been sent to her along with the invitation. The 21st floor was quiet at that hour, with morning light streaming in through the large windows and assistants moving between workstations with the usual early concentration. Rodrigo was waiting for her at the entrance to the conference room, together. He didn't say anything when he saw her arrive. He just stepped aside to let her in, with a gesture that had nothing to do with protocol or corporate courtesy, but something more like what someone does when opening the door to a place that they already know belongs to the other person. Valentina entered. Boardroom was the same as on Thursday, with everything laid out on display. The long table, the leather chairs, the windows with the city below. Board members were arriving, greeting each other, getting settled. Valentina took her seat. It was the first time she had done so. It was also, in a way that didn't need to be said out loud, the continuation of something that had begun 6 years earlier in an office at the High Court of Justice, with a green folder and 2 initials in pencil in the margin of some notes written by a man who believed that the truth was worth it, even if it cost everything. It cost everything, yet was worth it. Rodrigo sat to her right. Their eyes met for a second. Just that, a second, before the meeting began and the world went on, spinning with its usual noise of decisions and numbers and words that build the things that last. But in that second, there were 6 years of history. A green folder, a silver tray, a hand held in midair in front of 400 witnesses and 2 people who had arrived at the same place from completely different sides of the same map and and a new rule, written without paper or ink, but more permanent than any document either of them had ever signed. That the people who deserve to enter through the front door always enter.